The morning they gave Clara Ashby the cave, the sky over the Allegheny Valley was the color of old pewter, and the oaks on the hillside had already turned the deep rust red that meant Pennsylvania winter was not a rumor anymore. It was October of 1856. Clara was 25 years old, and she stood at the mouth of a hole in the ground with a cooking pot hanging from one hand and a bundle of clothes tucked under the other arm, and she watched two people walk away from her down the slope without once looking back. Arthur Ashby, broad shoulders, square beard, the deliberate stride of a man who had made a decision and saw no reason to revisit it. Ruth Ashby behind him, gray hair wound so tight against her skull, it pulled the skin at her temples into something resembling a permanent expression of judgment. They moved through the dry October brush and disappeared into the tree line, and the hillside was quiet, and Clara was alone. She understood with a clarity that required no translation exactly what they had just done. They had given her something they fully expected to kill her. She turned and looked at the cave. The entrance was wide, perhaps 15 feet across, carved into the limestone face of the hillside by water that had been patient for thousands of years. The ceiling above the entrance rose to 10 feet, and the floor was packed clay, hard and smooth, and it was dry despite the dampness hanging in the October air outside. She stepped in 2 paces, then 3. The darkness came slowly, the way cold water rises when you wade in from the shallows, rising past your knees, and then your waist before you have fully decided whether you intended to go this deep. She stopped, set down the pot, set down the bundle, and then she noticed the first thing that would save her life, though she did not know it yet. The cave was not warm, not comfortable by any measure a person accustomed to hearths and wool blankets would recognize. But it was not cold. There was a stillness to the air inside that had nothing to do with temperature dropping and everything to do with temperature simply not changing, like a held breath, like the inside of a stone church built 3 centuries ago, where the walls had long forgotten what seasons were. Clara pressed her palm flat against the limestone. The rock was cool and absolutely dry and faintly, almost imperceptibly warmer than the October air outside. She stood there with her hand against the stone and a question forming in her mind that she could not yet answer. Why is it warm? She filed that question away in the part of her mind where her father had taught her to keep things that mattered, the part that did not lose things, the part that worked on problems quietly while the rest of life continued above it. Then she walked back to the entrance and looked down the slope at the valley below, where a farmhouse sat behind a split-rail fence and smoke rose from its chimney in a thin, indifferent column. The farmhouse where Edmund Ashby had grown up. The farmhouse where Clara had spent 6 months learning to be invisible. She did not go back down that hill, not that night. She gathered sticks from the brush near the cave mouth, found 2 stones that would strike a spark, and built a fire so small it was really just a suggestion of a fire, a few fingers of flame at the entrance. She lay down on the clay floor with her coat pulled over her shoulders and the bundle of clothes as a pillow, and she listened to the wind move through the oaks outside, and she let herself think about Edmund. She let herself do it properly without flinching. Edmund Ashby had been 30 years old when he died, and he had been sick before Clara ever met him, though nobody had told her that. She had understood it in the first moment she saw him on the dock in Philadelphia in March of that year, when he walked toward her with his hat in his hands and his face arranged into the expression of a man trying to look healthier than he felt. He was thinner than his letters had suggested. His cheekbones cast shadows. When he lifted her traveling trunk into the wagon, he breathed hard afterward for longer than a man his age and size should have needed to. She had not said anything. She had learned from watching her mother that there are things a woman notices about a man and carries quietly, at least at first, because pointing them out too soon accomplishes nothing except making the man feel seen in ways he is not ready for. She had thought she would have time to know him properly. 6 months seemed like the beginning of something, not the whole of it. But Pennsylvania in the summer of 1856 had its own ideas about time. The fever came in late September and moved through Edmond the way fire moves through dry grass quickly and without negotiation. 12 days. Clara sat beside him for all 12, pressing cool cloths to his forehead spooning broth between his lips when he could manage it, holding his hand through the nights when the fever spiked, and he talked without knowing what he was saying. She learned more about him in those 12 days of delirium than in the 6 months before them. He talked about a horse he had loved when he was 8 years old. He called for his mother twice and then did not call for her again. He talked about the farm, about the north field that flooded in spring, about the particular way the light fell on the valley in November, as though he were trying to memorize it. And on the ninth day, in a window of clarity between the fever's surges, he opened his eyes and looked at her with eyes that knew exactly where they were, and he said something that she had been turning over in her mind ever since. "I'm sorry I didn't write more truthfully." She had pressed his hand and told him not to be sorry. But lying on the clay floor of the cave now, with the fire burning low and the night pressing against the entrance, she understood what he had meant in a way she had not fully allowed herself to understand before. He had known. He had known he was sick before he wrote the first letter, before he described the farm in careful, loving detail, the soil composition and the winter elevation, and whether the hollow drained well in spring. Before he asked her about Yorkshire and her father and whether she knew how to read the sky before a storm. He had known, and he had written anyway, and he had not once mentioned the thinness of his face, or the difficulty of his breathing, or the way he was fighting a body that had already begun its quiet retreat. He had been afraid she would not come, and she understood lying there in the dark with the limestone warm against her back that Arthur and Ruth Ashby had known too. Had known from the beginning, from before the letters began, and had let it happen, and had stood at the edge of that knowledge for 6 months, while Clara lived in their house and learned to be invisible and had never once said a word. She did not allow herself to stay with that thought long, not because it was too painful, but because it was not yet useful, and her father had taught her the difference between feelings that needed to be felt and feelings that needed to wait for the moment when they could be put to work. She closed her eyes and listened to the cave breathe around her and slept. In the morning, she went looking for Ezra Calloway. She had heard his name once in passing from a neighbor woman who had come to the farm in August with a basket of late summer squash and stayed long enough to drink tea and say several things that were not quite gossip, but were in the same neighborhood. Ezra Calloway lived up in the eastern hills, the woman had said, in a cabin he had built himself 40 years ago from whatever the forest offered. He had come to this valley before most people had learned things about the land that most people had never thought to ask, and had been old for as long as anyone could remember. The path to his cabin was not a path so much as a series of suggestions left by decades of one man's feet moving through the same forest in the same direction. Clara followed the broken branches and the slight depressions in the leaf litter and the line of least resistance through the trees until she came out in a small clearing where a cabin stood that looked less like something built and more like something that had grown there over many years and simply decided to stop growing when it reached the shape of a shelter. Ezra was sitting outside on a section of log, mending a trap with the focused patience of a man who had made peace with the pace at which careful work gets done. He was 83 years old and looked at the way very old trees look their age. Not diminished, but concentrated all the essential qualities refined down to something dense in particular. His beard was white and reached his chest. His hands were the hands of a man who had spent 60 years doing work that required them to be strong and precise. He did not look up when Clara came into the clearing. "You're staying in the cave," he said. "How did you know?" "Because you have a question in your eyes that only comes from sleeping somewhere that has surprised you." Clara sat down on a nearby rock and watched him work the trap. The clearing was quiet except for the sound of his hands and the distant sound of wind moving through the high branches above them. "It's warm," she said. "The cave, warmer than it should be." "Warmer than you expected," Ezra said, correcting her without sharpness. "It is exactly as warm as it should be." He set the trap down and looked at her for the first time. His eyes were the color of creek water in autumn, clear and patient and carrying something old in them. 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Give or take a degree every hour of every day, every month of every year. The earth at that depth has found its temperature, and it keeps it. The rock holds heat the way good iron holds heat. Slow to warm, slow to cool. Heat those walls and they'll give it back to you all night long, long after your fire is nothing but ash. He picked up the trap again and returned to his work, and Clara understood that he was not finished. This was simply how he spoke in pieces with space between them, the way a careful man lays out the parts of something he is repairing one at a time in order. The opening is too wide, he continued. 15 feet. The heat walks right out the door before it has a chance to settle. You need a wall, logs chinked with moss and clay. Leave yourself a door 6 feet wide centered, and a fire outside the wall, not inside. He paused. Fire inside the cave fills it with smoke before it fills it with warmth, and smoke will kill you before cold ever gets the chance. The fire goes just outside the entrance, positioned to push heat inward. Flat stones arranged in a wide curve to catch that heat and reflect it back the way a mirror works with light. Clara listened to all of it and stored it in the same careful place where she had put the question the previous night. Then she said, "You've lived in that cave." It was not a question. Ezra was quiet for a moment. The trap moved in his hands. 4 months, winter of 1816, when this cabin burned and I had nothing else to go to. He paused. I was warmer than I deserved to be some nights. There was something in the way he said it, a weight underneath the words that was not self-pity, but was something more earned than that. My daughter died in the winter of 1832, he said. 16 years old, we had a house, good walls, but I ran short on wood that year, and I did not know then what I know now about these hills and what they offer. I learned too late what I should have learned earlier. The clearing was very still. A cold wind moved through it once and then was gone. Clara did not offer him comfort because he was not looking for comfort. He was stating a fact that had made him who he was. The distinction mattered. I'll help you build the wall, Ezra said, not because you've asked me to, because it is the right thing to finish before I am done. He stood up his joints, announcing the decision audibly, and reached back inside the cabin door for a second coat. Come back tomorrow morning, he said. Bring that cooking pot. We'll start with the wall. Clara walked back down through the forest with the path making slightly more sense in both directions now. And when she came out at the edge of the tree line and the hillside opened up below her, she stood for a moment and looked at the Ashby farmhouse in the middle distance. She thought about Edmund lying in the ground 3 days' ride south. She thought about Arthur and Ruth in that house going about their evenings, deciding every night that they had done what was required and nothing more. She felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, something more like the particular clarity that arrives when you understand exactly where you stand and decide to stand there anyway. She went back to the cave and built up the fire and slept. On the 5th day, a young man came up the hill. Owen Briggs was 22 years old, broad in the shoulders, with the kind of open face that makes a person's thoughts visible before they have decided whether to share them. He was carrying a cloth-covered basket that his mother had clearly packed, because it contained the sorts of things mothers pack when they cannot in good conscience let a neighbor go hungry, but do not want to be seen participating in a controversy. Bread, a wedge of hard cheese, a jar of pickled beans. He set the basket down at the cave entrance and looked at the work Clara had already begun. The logs Silas had helped her start stacking the moss she had been packing into the gaps. My mother sent food, he said. I came because I wanted to see for myself. What did you want to see? He looked at her with the honesty of someone who has not yet learned to pretend he is not interested. Whether you were actually going to try to live here, or whether this was just stubbornness that would pass in a week. Clara took the basket and pulled back the cloth. She looked up at him. Would you like some tea? I have dried mint from the hillside. They sat at the cave entrance while the tea brewed in the pot, and Owen asked her about the wall, and she explained it. He asked about the fire arrangement, and she explained that too. He turned the information over in the way practical people do when something conflicts with what they assumed they already knew, not rushing to accept it, not rushing to dismiss it. You can't live here, he said finally. Not cruel, just the plain statement of a man citing what he understood to be physical fact. I'm going to live in this one, Clara said. He looked at her for a long moment. And then he nodded, accepting it the way a reasonable person accepts evidence that contradicts their theory, not enthusiastically, but without excessive argument. If you need wood or tools, he said, I can help some. Not because anyone told me to, because it's the right thing. He meant it. Clara believed he meant it, but 2 days later he did not come back. She understood the shape of what had happened without needing to be told. The valley was not large. Arthur Ashby supplied seed to most of the farms at the start of each planting season, the good imported grain that the smaller farms could not source on their own. Nora Sutton was the wife of the man who ran the grain cooperative, and she had ways of reminding people of arrangements that mattered, and none of those reminders needed to be explicit to be effective. Clara did not blame Owen Briggs. She understood the geometry of his situation with complete clarity because understanding the geometry of situations was something her father had taught her before she was 12 years old, standing in the small schoolroom in Yorkshire, while she worked through arithmetic problems that turned out to be about more than numbers. She understood Owen Briggs, and she stopped expecting anything from him, and she returned her full attention to the wall. And the wall required her full attention. She was up before dawn each morning, working until the light failed each evening, and Ezra came every morning without being asked, climbing the hill slowly with the small axe he had sharpened the night before. He showed her once how to read the grain of a log before splitting it, how to find the line of least resistance in the wood, the same way you find the current in a river, and then he stepped back and let her do it herself because he understood that a woman who was going to survive a Pennsylvania winter alone needed to own the knowledge in her hands, not just in her head. They worked mostly in silence. That suited them both. Her hands bled on the third day. She wrapped the cut in a strip torn from the hem of her oldest petticoat and kept working. They bled again on the seventh day and again on the 11th, and each time she wrapped them and kept working because the cold coming down from the mountains did not care about her hands, and neither did the calendar. There were 3 days in that first week when the temperature dropped fast in the afternoons, and the wind came off the ridge with a purpose that felt almost personal. And Clara would stand at the cave entrance in those evenings and look down at the Ashby farmhouse below, with its yellow lamplight in the windows, and she would feel the particular weight of a person who has been told in every possible way that she does not belong somewhere and has decided against all available evidence and advice to belong there anyway. She had arrived in this country with a husband and a future and a set of practical questions about soil drainage, and she had been left with a cooking pot and 5 acres of rock and a hole in a hillside, and the absolute certainty that she was expected to fail. What she had instead of certainty about her own survival was a question about warm limestone. She kept the question. She kept working. 3 days after the funeral, before Clara had moved up to the cave, Arthur had come to the door of the small bedroom where she had been sleeping since Edmond died. The bedroom at the back of the hall with the lowest ceiling and the window that faced north. She had understood from her first week in that house that this room had been selected for her rather than offered to her, and she had accepted it without comment because the hierarchy of a household that is not yours requires a kind of careful navigation that her mother had also tried to teach her, though with less success than the other lessons. Arthur had set 2 pieces of paper on the small table beside the door. He did not sit down. He stood with his hands at his sides and explained the situation with the efficiency of a man who had already decided what he was going to say and saw no reason to soften it. The first paper was a property document. Edmund had died without a will. Under Pennsylvania law, the farm, the house, the livestock, the equipment, all of it remained with the Ashby family. Edmund had known this. He had never been prompted to make other arrangements. Arthur left that last implication sitting in the room without naming it, the way you leave a piece of furniture that has always been there. Clara looked at the document. She looked at Arthur's face. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that a father who loved his son might have at some point in 20 years of watching that son grow into a man who wrote letters across an ocean to a woman he wanted to build a life with, mentioned the matter of a will. She did not say it because saying it would accomplish nothing except satisfying a feeling that did not deserve satisfaction at that particular moment. She looked at the second paper. 5 acres of hillside, mostly rock, with a cave that Arthur told her old Ezra Calloway had once described as good for storing root vegetables and not much else. This was her inheritance. This was Edmund's provision for her as interpreted by the people who controlled what Edmund's provisions would look like. Ruth spoke from just behind Arthur's shoulder, and Clara realized she had been standing there the whole time without making a sound, which took more effort than it appeared. "We'll give you until spring," Ruth said. "If you can make something of it, it's yours. If you can't, we'll buy the land back at fair value." A pause that lasted exactly long enough to make its meaning clear. "Which is nothing," Clara said. "I understand." Arthur picked up the papers and left. Ruth followed. Neither of them looked at her as they went. Standing now at the cave entrance in the late October dusk, watching the lamplight in the windows of that farmhouse below and the thin column of smoke from its chimney, Clara thought about those two people going about their evening in the certainty that they had done what was required and that she would be gone by spring. She thought about Edmund saying on the 9th day that he was sorry he had not written more truthfully. She thought about the warmth she had felt when she first pressed her palm against this limestone. One of these things was a door that could not be reopened. The other was a door that had not yet been fully opened at all. She went back inside the cave and built up the fire and pressed her hand against the stone and felt it give back the day's collected heat in a slow, steady way that did not care who she was or where she had come from, or whose daughter-in-law she had been for 6 months before she stopped being anyone's anything except her own. The fire burned down to coals. The cave stayed warm. She lay down on the clay floor and pulled her coat over herself and looked up at the limestone ceiling above her, dark and dry and patient, and she thought about all the people in the valley below who were waiting in their various ways for her to fail. Then she closed her eyes and slept. The wall went up in the first 2 weeks of October, and when it was finished, the cave changed. Not dramatically, not in the way of things that announced their transformation. It changed the way a frame changes a painting by giving the thing inside it edges and therefore meaning. Clara stood in the doorway on the evening the last log was chinked and looked inward and understood for the first time in her body, rather than just her mind, that she was not preparing a place to survive. She was building a place to live. The distinction mattered. She held on to it. The fire she built outside the entrance that first full evening performed exactly as Ezra had described. She had arranged the flat stones from the hillside in a wide curve facing the doorway, and she watched the heat move inward through the opening, and she felt the cave respond, the limestone warming under her hand by slow degrees, a reservoir filling. Not quickly, not dramatically. The way a good thing builds without announcing itself until one morning you wake and realize it has been there long enough to be trusted. She slept that night without waking once to cold. In the morning, she began expanding the small garden plot above the cave entrance, the sheltered corner where a natural overhang of rock cut the wind and the soil ran slightly deeper than the rest of the hillside. She was working a new section with the short-handled mattock, turning the earth to check its depth, before deciding whether it was worth planting the garlic sets she had traded for at the dry goods store in the village, when the blade struck something that was not rock, something that gave it a different sound, a duller, softer resistance. She dug around it carefully with her hands, a piece of cured leather folded and tied with cord that had dried to near brittleness wrapped around something flat. She brought it inside and unwrapped it in the better light near the entrance. It was a hand-drawn map. The ink had bled and faded, but the shapes were still legible. A rough diagram of the hillside from above with the cave marked clearly, and from it a series of lines indicating passages and chambers she had taken for simple cracks in the limestone. There were 2 marks she did not immediately understand, small circles with lines extending from them, and a notation beside each one that she had to bring the paper nearly to her nose to read. Water, said the first, good in drought. Air, said the second, keep clear. Warmth goes out if blocked. In the lower right corner, in the same careful hand, East 1833. Clara sat on the stone floor of her cave and held the 23-year-old map in her two cut and bandaged hands, and felt something move through her that she could not easily name. It was not gratitude exactly, though gratitude was part of it. It was closer to the feeling of being handed a letter written before you were born by someone who did not know you existed, who wrote it anyway because they understood that need does not wait for a specific recipient. She took the map to Ezra that afternoon. He was lying down when she arrived, which was new. In 3 weeks of morning work, he had always been outside waiting when she came up the path, already wearing his coat, already thinking about the next task. Seeing him horizontal on the narrow rope bed with a blanket pulled to his chest rearranged something in Clara's understanding of the situation she was in. She put the map in his hands without speaking. He looked at it without sitting up, turning it to catch the light from the small window. He was quiet for a long time. "I put it there in the spring of 1833, he said, "after my daughter died that winter. I thought someone would need it. Someone who would come to that hillside after I was gone and not know what I knew." He paused. "I did not expect to still be here when they found it." Clara looked at him. "You've been waiting 23 years. "The earth is not in our hurry," Ezra said. "I learned to match my pace to it." His breathing was audible in a way it had not been a week earlier. A slight unevenness at the bottom of each inhale, the sound of lungs that had spent too many winters in a mountain cabin and were beginning to present their bill. Clara built up his fire before she left. She came back the following morning and the morning after that, climbing to his cabin first before going to her own work, bringing broth she made from dried beans and whatever she could still find on the hillside that the cooling autumn had not yet finished. He let her do this without protest, which told her more about his condition than anything he said. She found the other thing Ezra had left her on a morning in early November, on a day when the temperature had dropped overnight and the breath came in small clouds, and the limestone walls of the cave held their warmth with a steadiness that was beginning to feel less like a surprise and more like a dependable fact. She had been exploring the interior of the cave with a burning stick, following the map's indicated passages toward the back sections where the light from the entrance thinned to almost nothing. The passages were narrow but navigable, the ceilings lower, the air still and cool. She was checking the second lozenge marked on the map, the air passage on the eastern side, when she brought the burning stick close to the wall and saw what had been cut into the limestone there. 2 letters and a number, EC 1816, Ezra Calloway. 40 years ago in the winter, he had described to her the winter after his cabin burned, and he had come to this cave with nothing and found it warmer than he deserved. He had pressed a blade into the stone and left his mark, not because anyone would see it, but because some things need to be recorded even when there is no audience, even when the only witness is the rock itself. Clara ran her thumb across the grooves in the limestone and felt the 40 years in them, the way you can feel the age in old wood, not by counting, but by pressing your palm against the grain and simply knowing. She did not tell Ezra about it that morning. She waited until the afternoon when he was sitting up and the light through his window was better, and then she brought him back to the cave and held the burning stick near the carving without saying anything. He looked at it for a long time. "I forgot I did that," he said. Clara did not believe this. She understood it was not meant to be believed. Some admissions come dressed as other things, and the thing they are dressed as is sometimes more honest than a direct confession would be. She lowered the stick, and they stood together in the dim interior of the cave, the old man and the young woman with 40 years of cold stone between them, and something that did not need to be named passing between them in the dark. Walking home from Ezra's cabin one evening in the 3rd week of October, with the temperature dropping fast in the first real edge of what was coming, Clara stopped on the path and stood still for a moment in the gathering dark. The valley below her was lit by the yellow light from farmhouse windows, small warm squares in the blue-gray dusk. Ezra's light behind her, the cave ahead. She thought, if Ezra does not make it through this winter, there will be no one in this valley who knows me as anything other than what Arthur and Ruth and Nora Sutton have decided I am. The thought arrived with a force she had not anticipated, not as self-pity, but as something more precise and therefore more difficult to manage. She was not afraid of being alone in the physical sense. She had already demonstrated to herself with considerable clarity that she could manage the physical facts of solitude. What she had not fully reckoned with was the possibility of being erased, of existing in this valley in the precise shape that other people's stories had made for her, with no one left who knew the difference between that shape and the actual one. She stood in the dark and let the feeling be exactly what it was. Then she walked back to the cave and added wood to the fire and went to sleep, because standing in the dark does not solve what the dark contains. It was in that same week that Nora Sutton came up the hill. She did not come alone. She brought two women from the valley with her, wives of neighboring farmers, chosen with the same instinct a person uses when they want witnesses to something they intend to characterize afterward. They came up the slope in a group, and their skirts catching on the dry brush Nora in front, with the purposeful efficiency of someone executing a plan she had been refining for several days. Clara was sitting at the cave entrance doing needlework when they appeared over the rise. She set the needlework down, but did not stand up. Nora stopped a few feet from the entrance and looked at the wall, at the hearthstones, at the orderly domesticity of what Clara had made from the hole in the ground that was supposed to finish her. Her face went through several things quickly, none of which she allowed to settle into a readable expression. "Well," she said, "you've made it into something." "I've made it into a home," Clara said. "It's a cave," Nora said. "A well-organized cave is still a cave." "A well-organized home," Clara said, "is still a home. Would you like to come inside?" Nora did not move, but the two women behind her exchanged a glance, and then the younger one stepped forward, and after a moment the other followed. They came through the doorway and stood on the stone floor, and Clara watched them look around, look up at the limestone ceiling, look at the quilts hung across the back section, look at the stored food in the natural niches of the rock. She watched them feel the temperature with their skin the way warmth registers before the mind has consciously noted it. She watched their faces do what faces do when reality contradicts expectation. The younger woman said something quiet to the other. Clara did not hear the words, but she heard the tone, which was not mockery. When they came back out, Nora was looking at them with an expression that required careful maintenance. She turned back to Clara and said with the conviction of someone who needs the last word to remain manageable, "Winter will test it properly. A few warm nights in October proved nothing." Clara did not answer. She picked up her needlework. And then, while Nora and her two witnesses were still watching, she turned and added two pieces of wood to the fire outside the entrance. The flame steadied and the warmth pushed inward, and the stone floor of the cave absorbed it with the patient indifference of something that has been doing this for a great deal longer than any of them had been alive. Nora turned and walked back down the slope without another word. Clara set her needlework down and looked at the valley. She thought about what the winter would be, about what it would ask of her and of the cave, and of the decision she had made to stay. She thought about Ezra in his cabin with his uneven breath. She thought about the map he had left in the ground for 23 years for a person he did not know. Pastor Gideon Hale came up the hill 3 days after Nora's visit. He came in the morning before Clara had gone to check on Ezra, and he stood at the cave entrance with his hat in his hands. He was 55 years old, with the careful face of a man who had spent decades listening to people in their worst moments and learned to keep his own reactions where they would not interfere with his usefulness. He looked at Clara the way he had looked at her across the churchyard on the day of Edmund's funeral, with an attention that was measuring something she could not quite name. "I hear you're staying," he said. "Yes. Arthur Ashby has supported this church for 10 years. He said it without inflection, as a piece of information rather than a threat, and she appreciated the honesty of the delivery. "I want you to understand my position." "I understand it." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the wall, at the hearthstones, at the evidence of what she had built. "Agnes came to see me last week," he said, using Ruth's church name, the formal name she went by among the congregation. "She asked me to encourage you to find more appropriate lodging, to suggest that a widow living alone on a hillside is an uncomfortable example for the community. And will you? No. He said it simply and without drama. I won't do that. He turned his hat in his hands. But I want you to understand that my ability to help you openly is limited. Arthur Ashby is not a man who forgets when someone crosses him, and I have a congregation to consider. He paused. What I can tell you is this. If you genuinely need something, come to me. Not as a parishioner, as a neighbor. I know this valley better than most people know it, and knowledge has its uses. Clara looked at him steadily. It could have been an offer. It could have been a warning. She suspected it was both. There is something I need to tell you, Pastor Hale said. He did not look away from her when he said it, which she noted. I was with Edmund in the nights before he died, not just for the service. I sat with him when the fever was high and the nights were long, and he talked to me in the way people talk when they are past the point of editing themselves. He paused. He talked about you a great deal. He said you had asked him in your letters about the soil and the elevation and whether the hollow drained well in spring. He said he knew from those questions that you would be all right here, that you were the kind of person who looked at a place honestly before deciding whether to love it. Clara was quiet. He didn't tell me he was ill before I came, she said. No. Pastor Hale held her gaze. Edmund told me on his second to last night. He said he had not told you because he was afraid you would not come. He said it was a selfish choice and he knew it. The hillside was very still around them. A single crow moved across the gray sky above the tree line and was gone. Arthur and Ruth knew, Clara said. It was not a question. They knew. Hale's voice was even and careful. I think that is part of why Ruth cannot look at you clearly. You are a reminder of something she allowed to happen. It is easier to decide you are inadequate than to ask the questions your presence raises. Clara stood with this for a moment, feeling the full shape of it settle into her understanding of the past 8 months. Not with bitterness exactly. With a particular exhaustion, the kind that comes when you have been fighting a current you did not know was there, and have only now seen it clearly enough to know what you were actually fighting against. Edmund was a good man, she said finally, who made a frightened choice. Yes, Hale said quietly. That describes most of us at one point or another. He put his hat back on. The offer stands, he said, as a neighbor. He left and Clara stood at the cave entrance for a long time after he was gone, looking at the valley and feeling the shape of what she now knew settle fully into place. She went up to check on Ezra. He was worse. Not dramatically, not in the way that serious decline announces itself with sudden gestures, but in the quiet incremental way that makes itself visible only in comparison to what came before. He was sitting up when she arrived, which was an improvement on the previous 2 days. But his color was poor and the unevenness in his breathing had deepened a slight labor at the bottom of each inhale that had not been there a week ago. She made him eat. She restacked his firewood closer to the door, where he could reach it without standing. She filled his water bucket from the spring and said nothing about any of it, because Ezra Calloway was a man who had lived alone for 50 years and did not require commentary on his situation from anyone. And she understood that the best care was the kind that did not make the person being cared for feel diminished by the fact of needing it. Before she left, she showed him the map again, the one she had been carrying folded in her coat pocket since she found it. She pointed to the second notation, the one about the air passage on the eastern side. I found it, she said. The opening on the east wall. There was debris partially blocking it. I cleared it last week. Ezra looked at the map and then at her. Good, he said. That's good. She walked back down to her cave as the afternoon light went flat and gray and the temperature dropped in the particular rapid way of a Pennsylvania afternoon. In late November, 10 degrees in an hour, 15 and 2, the cold coming down from the mountains with the directional certainty of something that knows exactly where it is going. Owen Briggs came back in the last week of October. He came without announcement and without explanation, carrying nothing, which meant he had come on his own account rather than on someone else's errand. Clara was outside splitting wood when she heard him on the slope, and watched him come over the rise with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes taking in the finished wall. The hearthstones, the orderly stack of split wood with the same expression he had had the first time. Surprised in a way he had not quite prepared himself for. He stood looking at the wall for a moment without speaking. "You finished it," he said, "3 weeks ago." He nodded, then walked to the doorway and looked in. He stepped inside and stood on the stone floor and was quiet for a long time, the way a person is quiet when they are recalculating something. Clara watched him from the entrance. "It's warmer than outside," he said. "Yes." "Considerably warmer." "Yes." He came back out and looked at the hearthstones and then back at the cave and then at her, and something in his face had shifted from surprise to something more complicated. He was 22 years old and he was working something out in real time, something that cost him something to work out. "I didn't come back after the first time," he said. "You know why." "I know why." It wasn't right. He said it plainly, a factual assessment of his own behavior delivered without drama, the kind of plain statement that costs something to make and costs more to mean. "Nora Sutton didn't threaten us directly, but the seat arrangement matters to my family, and she has ways of reminding people of that without saying it out loud. I know how it works." It still wasn't right. He looked at her directly. "I'm saying that because it's true, not because I'm about to do anything different. My family needs those seeds in the spring." He paused. "But I stopped repeating what people say about you. I can do that much." Clara looked at him for a moment. He was telling the truth about the limits of what he was able to offer, which was a more useful thing than a promise he could not keep. "That's something," she said, and she meant it. He nodded once and went back down the hill, and Clara returned to her splitting, and the wood pile grew by another 6 logs before the light failed. November deepened into December, and December had a weight to it that October did not. The days shortened until the light seemed like something rationed, given out in careful portions, and withdrawn before you had finished with it. The temperature dropped through ranges that had seemed abstract in October and became concrete and specific now, the difference between cold you could work through and cold that required a different kind of attention. Clara worked the garden through the first hard frosts, harvesting what could be harvested, storing what could be stored. She had built a system of natural niches in the cave walls into a larder of sorts: dried beans, in clay jars, salt pork, wrapped in cloth, dried herbs from the hillside arranged by type in hollows she had smoothed with a flat stone. Root vegetables packed in dry sand in the deepest section of the cave where the temperature stayed most constant. She visited Ezra every morning without fail. Some mornings he was well enough to sit outside and watch her work, offering corrections in the spare, precise way of a man who had learned that most instruction is best delivered in as few words as possible. Other mornings he was in bed, and she sat with him for a while after seeing to his fire and his food, and on those mornings he sometimes talked and sometimes did not, and either way, she stayed until he fell asleep or told her to go. He told her things in those conversations that she understood he had not told anyone in a long time, possibly not anyone ever. About the years in the coal mines before he came to this valley working seams that the foreman said were played out. And that turned out not to be learning to read rock the way some men learn to read weather, by paying attention long enough that the thing began to show you its patterns. About the farm he had tried to build in his first years here, the crops that failed and the crops that didn't, the particular education of learning what a piece of land could and could not do by asking it directly and listening to the answer. About his daughter. He did not talk about her often. When he did, it was always in the same way, briefly and without embellishment, as though the loss had been compressed by years into something very small and very dense. A stone he carried in a deep pocket that he sometimes took out and held for a moment before putting back. She had been 16. Her name had been Lila. She had her mother's eyes in his hands and a laugh that he said you could hear from the far side of the upper field. Clara listened to all of it and stored it in the same careful place. On the 13th of January, 1857, Ezra sat up from his bed in the morning before Clara had spoken a word, and said in the same unhurried voice he used to describe soil composition, "Today you prepare, tomorrow the storm comes." The sky that morning was clear, which was wrong for January. The air pressure had dropped in the night to something Clara felt in her ears before she understood what she was feeling. The animals on the hillside had gone wherever animals go when they know something is coming that people have not figured out yet. She had learned over 3 months of morning visits to trust Ezra's reading of things she could not read herself. She left his cabin at something close to a run. The next hours were the most purposeful she had spent since October. More wood cut and stacked inside the cave entrance where it would stay dry. The garden remnants pulled and stored. The water containers filled twice from the spring and set deep in the cave where the constant temperature would keep them from freezing. Extra stones heated in the fire and placed near the sleeping area. Every gap in the wall checked and rechecked, moss pressed deeper into any crack that showed light. The door to the wall braced from inside with a section of log angled against it at the bottom. By late afternoon, the preparations were finished. Clara stood at the cave entrance and looked down at the valley below. The Ashby farmhouse was visible a mile down the slope, its chimney releasing a thread of smoke into the still, cold air. The smoke rose straight up. No wind yet. That would change. She stood there longer than she had planned to, looking at that chimney smoke. And the question that had been forming for weeks, the one she had been aware of without fully facing, took its final shape in her mind. The smoke was thin, too thin for a house trying to stay warm against what was coming. She had noticed it before in passing without allowing herself to linger on what it meant. But now she lingered. She had also noticed the last time she had walked the road past the farm 2 weeks ago that the wood pile on the south side of the house was down to its last few rows. She had noticed it the way she noticed most things without meaning to and without being able to stop. It was simply data filed in the part of her mind that filed such things automatically without judgment or interpretation. Arthur and Ruth Ashby had lived in this valley for 30 years. They had survived Pennsylvania winters for 30 years. They knew the signs and they knew the preparations, and they were almost certainly fine. But the chimney smoke was thin, and the wood pile had been low 2 weeks ago, and Ezra had said that tomorrow the storm was coming. Clara stood at the cave entrance with the cold coming down off the ridge behind her and felt the question settle into the space where the answer would have to go. What was her responsibility to people who had wanted her to disappear? She genuinely did not know. It was not a simple question. The resentment was real and the history was real, and what they had done was real, all of it documented in the part of her mind that did not lose things. But the thin smoke was also real, and the low wood pile was real, and the storm that Ezra had announced with the calm certainty of a man who had learned to read the earth was real, and none of those things cared about the history between the people below and the woman above. She went inside, she built up the fire, she braced the door, she lay down in the warmth that the limestone gave back slowly and steadily from the day's heat, and she looked up at the dark ceiling above her, and she thought about Edmund asking about the soil in her letters, and about Ezra pressing his name into this rock in the winter of 1816, because some things need to be recorded even when there is no audience. She thought about thin smoke and low wood piles and what was coming down off the mountains. The cave was warm around her. Outside, the first wind of the approaching storm moved through the oaks. On the hillside, a sound like something taking a long, slow breath before it spoke. The storm came at dawn on the 14th of January, 1857, and it did not come gradually. It came the way certain truths arrive all at once, and without apology, without the courtesy of a warning you could act on. Clara had been awake for an hour before it hit, lying in the warmth of the cave with her eyes open in the dark, listening to the wind that had begun sometime in the night, and had been building since, working itself up through registers that went from concerning to serious to something beyond serious. Something that had a quality of intention to it, as though it had been gathering itself across 1,000 miles of open country and had finally found the mountains it had been looking for. She rose and dressed in every layer she had. She added wood to the fire outside the wall and checked the door brace and pressed her hands against the wall in 2 places to feel the warmth stored in the logs. Then she opened the cave door to check the state of things outside. The wind took the door out of her hand. Snow drove horizontally into her face with a force that was not weather but assault. The accumulated fury of a storm that had crossed the open plains and spent everything it had saved on this one moment of arrival. She could not see the hearthstones 2 feet in front of her. She could not see the tree line. She could not see anything except white moving sideways with a violence that made the word snow seem wholly inadequate for what it was describing. She got the door shut. She braced it again and stood with her back against it for a moment, her heart working harder than she would have liked to admit, and she understood immediately and completely that Ezra Calloway had not been wrong. She did not try to open the door again that day, or the next day, or the day after that. 3 days inside the cave while the world outside ceased to exist. 3 days in which the universe contracted to the dimensions of one limestone room, one fire, one woman, and the slow, patient warmth that the stone gave back from its walls at the same steady rate, regardless of what was happening on the other side of them. On the first day, Clara thought about Edmund. Not the Edmund of the last 12 days. The one she had sat beside in the long, feverish nights, pressing cloths to his forehead and spooning broth between his lips and holding his hand through the hours when he talked without knowing what he was saying. She thought about the Edmund of the letters, the one who had written to her about soil drainage and winter elevation and the particular way the light fell on the valley in November, as though he were describing something he loved and wanted her to love too, before she had seen it for herself. She thought about the questions she had written back, about the hollow and whether it flooded in spring, about the elevation and what it meant for the length of the growing season, about the rock composition of the hillside and whether it was limestone or sandstone and what that meant for the water table. She had been 24 years old sitting at the small desk in her father's schoolroom in Yorkshire, writing questions about Pennsylvania soil to a man she had not yet met, and she had not been writing to impress him. She had been writing because the answers mattered. Because if she was going to cross an ocean and build a life somewhere, she wanted to understand the ground she would be building on. Edmund had told Pastor Hale that he knew from those questions that she would be all right here. She thought about that for a long time in the quiet of the cave, with the storm raging at a volume that penetrated the walls as a low, constant vibration rather than a sound. She thought about what it meant that a dying man's last settled certainty had been about her capacity to survive the place he was leaving her in, not about whether she would be cared for, not about whether his family would treat her fairly, about whether she herself had what was required. He had known her in the end more accurately than anyone else in this valley. On the second day, Clara thought about her father. She thought about the schoolroom in Yorkshire, with its one window that faced south, its smell of chalk dust and old wood, and the particular mineral smell of the stone walls that had been standing since before anyone currently living could remember. She thought about her father setting her arithmetic problems that were secretly lessons in something else entirely, in how to look at a situation and identify its actual structure beneath the surface it presented. He had done this consistently from the time she was old enough to hold a pencil until the morning she left for Liverpool to board the ship. Problems that looked like questions about numbers, but were actually questions about leverage, about patience, about the difference between what a thing appeared to be and what it actually was. He had taught her to ask why before she asked how, because the why contained the how if you pressed on it long enough. She thought he would approve of the cave. He would come up the hill and look at the wall and the hearthstones and the stored provisions and the map on its folded leather, and he would ask detailed questions in the precise, unhurried way. He asked all questions, and he would nod as she answered, and he would not say he was proud of her, because that was not how he expressed himself. But the questions would contain the pride. The quality of his attention would contain it. And she would know. She missed him with a directness that surprised her there in the dark of the storm, and she let herself miss him properly for a little while before she put it away. On the third day, Clara thought about Arthur and Ruth Ashby. She had not planned to. The thought arrived without invitation and stayed without permission, the way important thoughts tend to do when you have been keeping them at a careful distance and have finally run out of the energy required for the keeping. Two people in a farmhouse a mile below on the valley floor, with a wood pile that had been low 2 weeks ago and a chimney that had been producing a thread of smoke rather than a column. She had been in that house for 6 months. She knew its dimensions. She knew the size of the hearth and the way the cold came in through the north-facing windows in the distance from the back door to the woodpile on the south side. She knew the Windsor chair in the corner of the parlor and the rag rug in front of the hearth and the way the kitchen held heat better than the rest of the house because of the cook stove. She thought about Arthur Ashby with his square beard and his pale winter sky eyes, the man who had stood in the doorway of her smallest room and laid out the terms of her dispossession with the efficiency of someone who had decided what he was going to say and saw no reason to soften it. She thought about Ruth with her tight gray hair and her permanent expression of measured judgment, and the one moment standing behind Arthur's shoulder in that doorway when Clara had realized she had been there the whole time without making a sound. She thought about what she actually felt about these two people. She had expected to find anger when she looked directly at it. She had been maintaining a careful distance from the full examination for months, and she had assumed that what she would find when she finally looked would be something hot and justified and difficult to manage. What she found instead was simpler and more surprising. She did not want them to die. The certainty of it arrived without drama, without the complications she might have expected. It was not qualified by the history between them. It was not softened by sentiment or sharpened by a desire to be the kind of person who did not want her enemies to die. It was simply true the way the temperature of limestone is simply true without interpretation, without the need for anyone to feel a particular way about it. They were people. They were in a house a mile below her with not enough wood in a storm that had been building across 1,000 miles to spend itself on this valley. And she was the only person within reach who knew how bad it was going to be and who was capable potentially of doing something about it. That was the whole of the calculation. When the storm stopped on the morning of the 17th, the silence fell over the mountain like something physical, a weight and a softness at the same time, the silence of a world that has been entirely remade overnight and has not yet decided what it is going to say about itself. Clara waited an hour to be certain. Then she dressed in everything she had. She took the short-handled mattock from its place near the wall, pushed the door open against the packed snow behind it, and looked out at what remained of the world. 8 feet of white. Everything that had been the landscape 3 days ago was gone, replaced by a continuous surface of snow that covered the hearthstones and the garden overhang and the slope below the cave entrance, and extended in every direction without differentiation, as though the storm had decided that the distinctions between things were a problem and had resolved the problem in the most thorough way available. Clara stood in the cave entrance and looked at it for a moment. She thought about the distance to the Ashby farmhouse. She thought about the mattock handle and what it could tell her about depth before each step. She thought about the temperature, which was the serious, purposeful cold of a storm that has finished its work and left the results for others to manage. Then she started down the hill. The snow came to her shoulders in the open sections. In the places where the drifts had built against the natural features of the slope, it was deeper than that, and she drove the mattock handle down before each step in those sections, reading the resistance to determine where the ground was and whether it would hold her. The tree line offered some relief. The canopy had broken the accumulation, and the passage between trunks was navigable, if not easy. But below the tree line, the valley floor was buried under a uniform depth that erased every familiar reference point. She moved by direction and by the faint memory of the land beneath the white, by the knowledge she had accumulated over 4 months of walking this slope in every condition it had offered. She knew where the drainage ditch ran along the lower field. She knew where the ground rose slightly before the split rail fence. She knew the fence was there, even though she could not see it. Her hands went numb inside her gloves before she reached the tree line. Below the tree line, they went past numb to something that was not quite pain and not quite the absence of pain, a state that required neither complaint nor attention, simply acknowledgement and continuation. She acknowledged it and continued. She knew before she reached the house. The chimney was not producing smoke. Not thin smoke, not the thread she had been watching with unease for 2 weeks. Nothing. The chimney stood against the white winter sky with the blankness of something that had been cold for a long time. She drove the mattock into the snow, packed against the south door, and cleared enough to get her hand to the wood, and she knocked, and she waited, and she heard from inside the slow and muffled sound of someone moving, who has been sitting very still for a very long time. Someone conserving everything, including motion. The door opened inward, away from her hand. Ruth Ashby stood in the gap with 3 blankets around her shoulders and her breath visible in the air of her own house, which told Clara everything she needed to know about how the last 3 days had gone on the other side of that door. The cold inside was not the cold of a house that had briefly lost its fire. It was the cold of a space that had been giving up heat for a long time and had given up most of what it had. Ruth looked at her without speaking for a moment. Her face had shed its habitual architecture entirely. The tight arrangement of features that communicated permanent judgment, the careful structure of a woman who had decided that her assessment of the world was more reliable than the world's assessment of itself, all of it was gone. What was underneath was older and simpler. A face that had spent 72 hours being genuinely afraid and had run out of the energy required to be anything else. "Clara," she said, "just the name. Nothing attached to it." "I need you to come with me," Clara said. "Both of you, right now." Ruth stepped back from the door and Clara pushed through into the house. The fireplace held a small heap of coals that had not been fed in hours. Beside the hearth, 3 chair legs were stacked near the coal scuttle, the remains of what had been the Windsor chair from the corner of the parlor, the chair Clara had looked at every evening for 6 months from the edge of other people's conversations. Arthur had burned it to stay warm. He had burned the chair before he admitted to himself that the situation required something beyond what he could manage alone. Arthur was in the chair nearest the remaining coals. He was sitting upright, which required a visible effort. The effort of a man for whom certain postures are non-negotiable, regardless of circumstances. A man who had decided long ago that how you held yourself when things were difficult was not a small matter. He was wearing his coat over 2 sweaters. His hands were wrapped in a pair of wool stockings. His beard was untrimmed in a way that spoke of days spent focusing on more pressing things. He looked up when Clara came in, and she saw in his face something she had never seen there before and had not expected to see. He was frightened. Not of her, of what the last 3 days had shown him about the distance between 30 years of competence and absolute certainty. He had built this farm from raw land. He had survived Pennsylvania winters before Clara was born. He had managed every difficulty this valley had offered for 3 decades, with the self-sufficiency of a man who understood that depending on others was a form of weakness he could not afford. In 3 days of storm had stripped that certainty down to something much simpler and much more honest. "The chimney is blocked," he said. His voice was steady. He was working to keep it steady, and the work was visible. "Drift on the roof," Ruth said from behind Clara. He tried to clear it from inside, couldn't reach. "The wood is gone," Arthur said. The 2 words cost him something. She could see the cost in the set of his jaw. "The indoor stack went yesterday afternoon. The outdoor pile is under 8 feet of snow, and the door won't open enough to dig." Clara looked at him directly. "Can you walk?" "I can walk." "Then we're going now. The cave is 20 minutes in normal conditions. Today it will take longer. Dress in everything you have." Arthur did not move immediately. She watched him sit with the requirement she had just placed in front of him, watched him work through whatever internal negotiation was required between the man he had been for 68 years and the man the last 3 days had left him. There was something in his face that was older than pride, something more structural than pride, the deep, load-bearing beam of a man's sense of himself, and she could see it doing battle with the simple, unambiguous arithmetic of survival. She did not push him. She had learned enough about Arthur Ashby to understand that pushing would cost more time than waiting. "We cannot accept charity from you," he said. Not cruel, almost formal, as though he were citing a term in a contract they had both agreed to. Clara looked at him steadily. She did not raise her voice. "Edmund loved you," she said. "I know that because he talked about you in the nights when he was dying, not with anger, not with complaint, just with the plain love of a son who learned everything he knew from his father, who measured himself against his father for his entire life and was not ashamed of the measuring." She paused. "If you die in this house because you could not accept help from me, Edmund will not forgive you for it, and you know that is true." The room was very quiet. The coals ticked softly in the hearth. Outside, the wind moved through the branches of the oak by the south window, the first wind since the storm had ended, light and provisional, as though the weather were testing whether the world was ready to resume. Arthur stood up. It cost him something visible. His knees, the elevation, the layers of clothing, all of it took longer than it would have taken 6 months ago, and he did not look at her while he did it. But he stood and he looked at Ruth and he said, "Get your coat." And that was the end of the negotiation. The walk back up the hill took nearly 2 hours. Clara went first, driving the mattock handle through the snow before each step in the uncertain sections, reading the slope beneath the white surface the way she had learned to read it over 4 months of daily familiarity. Arthur came behind her, and Ruth came behind Arthur, one hand on his arm. Not because she needed the support, because she was providing it in the quiet way of a woman who has been providing support to the same man for 40 years and does not require an audience for it. The three of them moved up the hill in a line through the cold, bright morning without conversation, because all their breath was needed for the work of moving forward, and because there was nothing to say yet that the situation had not already said more clearly than words could manage. When they came over the last rise and the cave entrance appeared before them, the fire that Clara had banked before leaving was still producing a thin thread of smoke from the hearthstones, and the wall stood solid and unchanged, exactly as it had stood since October, as though it had been waiting. Arthur stopped. He stood in the snow and looked at what Clara had built. Not quickly, not with the evaluating glance of a man checking an assumption against a result. He looked at it the way a person looks at something that has required them to revise a belief they held for a long time, slowly, and with a quality of attention that is also a form of admission. Then he stepped forward and put his hand on the log wall. Clara watched him feel the warmth that had accumulated in the wood from 3 days of banked fire radiating steadily outward through the chinking. She watched his hand press flat against the logs and stay there, and something in the quality of that staying told her more than anything he had said or could say. Ruth walked past both of them and through the doorway without speaking. Clara heard her stop just inside. "Come in," Clara said to Arthur. He came in. The cave was 60 degrees after the cold outside and the failing cold of the farmhouse, and 60 degrees in that context landed differently than it would have on an ordinary day. It was not the dramatic warmth of a roaring fire. It was something better, something more fundamental. A warmth that existed equally at the entrance and at the back wall, and in the air above and against the floor below. A warmth that did not require proximity to a single source, that did not diminish as you moved away from it, because it was not coming from any one place, but from every surface simultaneously. The cave was the warmth. The stone was the warmth. The walls and the ceiling and the floor were all giving back at the same slow, steady rate the heat they had absorbed and stored and held. Clara watched it reach Arthur and Ruth, watched their shoulders come down from around their ears slowly and without their appearing to notice it happening. Watch their breathing change from the shallow, economical breathing of people conserving heat to something slower and more complete, the breathing of bodies that have been given permission to stop being afraid. Ruth put her hand on the limestone wall. She held it there for a long time. Her eyes were closed. Clara got the fire outside built up properly, then came back in and began heating broth from the stores she had put up in the autumn. She worked at the small cooking arrangement near the entrance and did not make conversation, because what Arthur and Ruth needed in that first hour was not conversation, but warmth and silence. and the gradual return of the body's confidence in its own continuation. They ate all three of them, sitting on the flat stones near the entrance, eating bean broth from the 3 tin cups Clara owned. The food was plain and the situation was not what any of them would have designed, and nobody said anything false about it. On the fourth night, Clara woke in the dark and heard Ruth crying. It was not loud. It was the kind of crying that has been held back for a long time and moves through a person quietly. When the holding finally gives way, the way a river moves differently in its underground sections, constrained by the rock around it, into something quieter and more pressurized than what it becomes in the open air. Clara lay still and listened. She did not pretend to be asleep, but she did not speak either. She understood that some things need to happen without an audience, even when an audience is present, that the gift you give in those moments is the gift of your inattention, the pretense that the darkness is sufficient privacy. In the morning, Ruth was herself again, the composed and measured version of herself, straight-backed and precise. But something had shifted at a level below expression, below the surface architecture she showed the world. Clara could see it. She did not know yet exactly what to do with it, but she filed it in the part of her mind that held things patiently until their time came. On the 8th day, Arthur and Clara were sitting at the cave entrance in the early morning, while Ruth slept looking out at the white valley below where the snow was beginning to show the faint blue shadows that meant it was starting very slowly to reconsider its position. Arthur had been quiet for a long time. Clara had learned in 8 days of close quarters that his silences were not empty. They were working silences, the silences of a man organizing something he intended to say precisely. "I knew the cave wasn't worthless," he said. Clara turned to look at him. He was looking at this valley, not at her. His hands rested on his knees. His beard needed attention. He looked for the first time since Clara had known him like a man, rather than a position, like someone who had arrived at a moment through a long chain of choices and was finally looking at the chain clearly enough to see where it had bent. "Ezra Calloway came to see us the winter we arrived here," he said, 30 years ago. "He came to every new family that first year, those of us who were green enough to need it. He told us about the valley, the water, the soil, which hollows flooded in spring, which hillsides held heat longer into autumn." He paused. "He told me about the caves on the eastern slope. He described the one you're living in, described what it could do." Clara said nothing. She waited. "I worked limestone mines for 4 years when I first came to this country," Arthur said, "before I had enough to buy this land. I know what rock does with heat. I know what Ezra was telling me." The morning was very quiet around them. "When I gave it to you," Arthur said, "I wanted you gone. I want you to understand that I am not pretending otherwise. I wanted you to leave and stop being a reminder of what we lost, of what I allowed to happen." He looked at his hands. "But I could not give you something that would kill you outright. I could not do that to Edmund's memory, and I could not do it to myself, whatever else I am." He was quiet for a moment. "The cave was the best I could offer without losing the face I needed to keep. I thought you would try for a week and then go. I did not think you were the kind of woman who would actually do what you did." The valley below them held its silence. "I was wrong about what kind of woman you are," Arthur said. "I was wrong about many things. I am telling you this because Edmund would want me to, and because at 68 years old, sitting in a cave that a 25-year-old woman built from a hole in the ground, I find I have less patience than I once did for continuing to be wrong about things I have the opportunity to correct." Clara looked at the valley for a while. She thought about all the mornings she had come down this slope and looked at the farmhouse below and felt the complicated weight of existing in a place that was not willing to receive her. She thought about Edmund writing letters full of questions about soil drainage. She thought about Ezra pressing his mark into this limestone in 1816, 40 years before she pressed her own hand against it in the dark. "Thank you," she said, "for not giving me something that would kill me outright." Arthur looked at her quickly. It was not what he had expected her to say, and for a moment something moved across his face that had not been there before, something that rearranged his features in a way that was unfamiliar and then suddenly briefly recognizable. One corner of his mouth moved upward by a fraction. Not a smile exactly. The muscular memory of one, the ghost of an expression that had belonged to someone younger and less defended. It changed his face entirely for just a moment. It showed her the man Edmund had grown up loving. "You are a difficult woman to have been wrong about," he said. "I've been told," she said. Ruth came to stand beside Clara at the cave entrance on the day before they went back down to the farmhouse. The valley was beginning to show its bones again through the retreating snow. The dark lines of fences, the bare geometry of the orchards, the familiar shapes of a landscape reasserting itself after the interruption. Ruth stood with her hands folded in front of her looking at it. Clara stood beside her and waited because she had learned over 10 days in close quarters that Ruth arrived at what she needed to say by a route that could not be rushed, that the directness of her eventual speech was something she prepared for at length, the way a person prepares for a difficult crossing by standing on the bank long enough to understand the current. "I was wrong about you from the beginning," Ruth said. "Not wrong in a simple way, wrong deliberately. I needed you to be inadequate because if you were adequate, I had to ask why I hadn't seen it sooner and why Edmund had to die before I learned anything true about the woman he chose." She stopped and breathed. "I gave you this cave because I wanted you to fail. I want you to know that and that I have known it since October and that I continued to act on it anyway. I am not offering that as an excuse. I am offering it as an accounting." "I know," Clara said. "I know you know." Something moved in Ruth's voice that required effort to produce. "You saved the lives of two people who were unkind to you in every way they were capable of being unkind. You did it without condition, without making us feel the weight of what we owed you while you were doing it." She paused. "Edmund would be proud of you. He would be proud in the particular way he was proud of things quietly and for a long time without making a display of it." Clara felt something move in her chest. Not grief exactly, though grief was part of it. Something closer to the feeling of a door opening had you had stopped expecting to open, the particular quality of surprise that arrives when something you had written off as permanently closed turns out to have been only latched. "Edmund would be proud of you too," Clara said. "For this, for coming here and staying and saying this." Ruth looked at her. For the first time, the look was direct and unguarded without the filtering mechanism that had been operating since the dock in Philadelphia when two women who loved the same man had met each other for the first time across the unbridgeable distance of his dying. It lasted only a moment, but it was the real thing. "I would like you to come to dinner on Sunday," Ruth said. "When the roads are clear and the chimney is repaired, I would like you to come and sit at the table properly." A pause. "As family." "I'll come," Clara said. 2 days later, when the sun had worked on the snow long enough that the valley roads were passable, Pastor Hale came up the hill. He did not come alone. Owen Briggs was behind him carrying a load of firewood on his shoulder that was not a courtesy bundle, but a serious load, the kind you carry when you intend it to mean something. Behind Owen were two farmers from the valley whose names Clara did not yet know, and they were carrying food and more wood with the purposeful energy of people who have decided that a situation requires action and have arrived prepared to take it. Nora Sutton came too. She came last up the slope and stood at the back of the group, and her reasons for coming were her own business, whether they were guilt or calculation or the social instinct of a woman who understands when a position has become untenable. Arthur came out of the cave when he heard them on the slope. He was steadier than he had been 10 days ago. The cave and Clara's food and the simple fact of not dying had restored something to him. Not the full force of the man he had been at 50, but something that stood straight and looked out at the gathering of his neighbors with clear eyes and an economy of expression that Clara had come to understand was not coldness, but precision. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Clara Ashby walked a mile through 8 feet of snow to bring my wife and me out of a house that was killing us," he said. "She fed us from stores. She built herself from a cave. She built herself from a hillside I gave her because I expected it to defeat her." He looked at the group assembled before him, and his gaze moved to Nora. Sutton settled there for a moment, then moved on. Anyone in this valley who has something to say about this woman should have said it to me 8 months ago, because that is when it would have mattered. Now it does not matter at all, because she has already proven everything that needed proving. The morning air held all of it. Nora Sutton looked at the ground. The two farmers, whose names Clara did not know, looked at Arthur and then at Clara and nodded the simple nod of men acknowledging a plain fact. Owen Briggs set down his bundle of firewood, walked through the group to the cave entrance, and carried it inside without asking permission. The way you carry wood into a neighbor's house when you know you should have been doing it all along. Pastor Hale came to stand beside Clara. He looked at the cave, at the wall, at the hearthstones, at Arthur still standing before the gathered valley with the bearing of a man who has just done something that cost him and does not regret the cost. Edmund was right about you, Hale said quietly. He said you would look at a place honestly before deciding whether to love it. I think he meant more than places. He usually did, Clara said. Ezra Calloway died on the 14th of April, 1857, on a morning when the hillside was running with snowmelt and the first green was showing on the south-facing slopes, and the air had the particular quality of Pennsylvania spring cold still, but with something underneath the cold that was not cold, something that had been waiting under the frost all winter and was now beginning to say so. Clara was with him. She had been going up every day since January, and she had been there on enough of those days when he was well enough to talk that she had accumulated something like a portrait of him in his own words. The man who had come to Pennsylvania from the Carolinas with nothing but his hands and a determination to find out what he was made of. The father he had been attentive and imperfect and devoted. The solitary he had become after his daughter died, learning to make of solitude not a deprivation, but a discipline, learning to make of the land not just a livelihood, but a conversation. He was not afraid. She would not have expected him to be. He talked in the morning about the cave, about specific plants in specific seasons, about the east-facing slope above the garden, where the soil was deeper than it appeared and would grow root vegetables better than anywhere else on the hillside. She stored everything in the part of her mind her father had taught her to use for things that mattered. In the early afternoon, he was quiet, and she sat beside him with her hand on his and listened to his breathing slow in the way that breathing slows when the body is arriving at a conclusion it has been working toward for a long time. He died in the mid-afternoon with the April light coming through the small window at an angle that caught the dust in the air and made it visible, thousands of small, particular things floating in the light that were always there and usually invisible. Clara sat with him for a while after. She had done this before with Edmund, and she knew there was a period immediately following a death when the room still held the shape of the person in it, when the air still carried some quality of recent presence, and she had learned to honor that period rather than rush through it. She buried him beside the cabin herself in the earth he had spent 60 years learning to read. Pastor Hale came through the trees while she was finishing and stood beside her and spoke the words over Ezra Calloway's grave that Ezra himself would probably not have requested, but that the living need to say over the dead for their own reasons as much as the dead man's. Clara set the stone she had chosen at the head of the grave flat and large enough to receive the words she had cut into it with a borrowed chisel over 2 evenings. She had spent a long time deciding what to write, not because she could not think of enough things, but because she could think of too many. And in the end, she had returned to the simplest thing, the thing he had told her on the first day, and that she had carried every day since. He taught me that the earth does not care what the weather does above. She stood at the grave with Pastor Hale beside her, in the April hillside running green around them, and thought about the shape of a life that had ended here. A man who had come with nothing and learned everything and left knowledge buried in the ground and carved in stone and drawn on folded leather for whoever came after him. A man who had spent 23 years waiting for the right person to find what he had prepared and who had lived long enough to watch her use it. That seemed to her like a life that had accomplished what it set out to do. She lived in the cave for 3 more years, not because she had no other options and not because she was hiding from anything, but because the cave had become through her own work and her own learning and the education Ezra had given her, the place where she understood herself most clearly. And you do not leave a place like that until you are sure you will carry it with you wherever you go. Arthur Ashby began coming up the hill in the spring of 1858, not regularly, not with announced purpose, but occasionally on Sunday afternoons when the farm work allowed it. He would appear at the cave entrance with something practical in his hands, a length of rope, a spare axe handle, a jar of the beeswax that Ruth rendered from their hives. He never stayed long. He would deliver whatever he had brought and look around at the pueu and the garden and the evidence of Clara's continued competence, and then he would go back down the hill. But he kept coming. Clara understood that this was his version of the Sunday dinners at the farmhouse where Ruth had made a space for her at the table and filled it with the small particulars of daily life that accumulate over time into something that resembles family. Arthur could not do it at a table. He could do it on a hillside with a jar of beeswax and 15 minutes of mostly silent company, and Clara accepted this as the form it was going to take and was grateful for it without requiring it to be something it was not. In the summer of 1859, Arthur came up on a Sunday afternoon and told her there was someone he wanted her to meet. He said it with the particular combination of casualness and deliberateness that people use when they have been thinking about something for some time and have decided that the time for thinking is over. Samuel Pratt was 40 years old, a widower with 3 children and a farm on the north side of the valley that he had worked alone for 2 years since his wife died. He had the hands of someone who worked in all weathers and the eyes of someone who had been through enough to stop pretending that things were simpler than they were. Clara learned afterward that Arthur had ridden to Samuel's farm in early spring and sat at his table and told him in the direct and somewhat inconvenient way that Arthur Ashby told people things, that there was a woman in this valley who had earned the right to be looked at seriously by a man capable of looking seriously, and that if Samuel considered himself such a man, Arthur would arrange an introduction. Samuel had said he considered himself willing to find out. They did not rush. They met through the autumn of 1859 and talked with the honest thoroughness of 2 people who have each already survived loss and know better than to be careless about what they choose next. She told him about Edmund. He told her about his wife. They talked about his children and about the land and about what each of them was actually asking for, which is a conversation that most people avoid having directly, but that Clara had learned through the particular curriculum of the past 3 years to value above almost any other kind. They married in the spring of 1860. She moved to his farmhouse. She kept the cave. Samuel understood this without requiring an explanation, which told Clara something important about him, something she filed carefully alongside everything else she had learned to file carefully over the past 4 years. Arthur Ashby died in December of 1862 in the house he had built 30 years before with Ruth beside him and Clara in the room. He had been declining since the previous spring slowly, and with the same deliberate dignity he brought to everything, and in the last weeks he had been mostly quiet, conserving whatever remained for the things that genuinely required it. On his last clear day, he asked Clara to sit beside him, and she did, and he looked at her for a while without speaking, in the way of people who have moved past the point where speech is the primary means of reaching each other. "The cave," he said finally. "I'll keep it," she said. "I promised you." He nodded. He was quiet for another moment. "Not just the land," he said. "The story. The story is the part that matters. Don't let them lose the story." She kept both. The land passed to the next generation and the generation after that, used as a root cellar, in a storm shelter, in an emergency refuge, through 4 generations of Ashby and Pratt descendants who did not always know why they kept it, but felt in the vague way that inherited things are felt, that letting it go would be losing something they could not replace. She brought her children up to it on Saturday mornings, all of them, and she showed them the hearthstones and the wall and the carved initials deep in the limestone, EC 1816, and she told them the story, the way stories are meant to be told, not as history, but as something still alive, still asking something of the people who hear it. The earth does not know what month it is. It holds its temperature, and it holds its silence, and it holds the marks of everyone who ever learned to trust it, and it waits for the next person who has enough questions and enough willingness to press their hand against the stone and feel what is already there waiting to be received. Clara Ashby pressed her hand against that stone in the autumn of 1856 and did not let go. That is why she lived. That is why they all lived. That is the whole of it.